Ruby. So she's with Youth Rise in Ireland. And Ruby, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So hi, everyone. My name is Ruby Lawler. I'm the Executive Director of Youth Rise. I'm based in Ireland, currently from Ireland, but have lived for the past few years in Uganda. And I'm really excited to be here. I'm 25 years old. I'm a young person who uses drugs, and I'm excited to talk about this topic.
That's great. So for everyone who's just joining, I'm Sachi. I'm with TJC. I'm 22 this year, and I've only recently joined TJC at the beginning of this year. And I'm really excited for what this session is the conversations this session is going to spark. So with that, we can get started. So Ruby, could you tell us more about your organization and the support you provide for those involved with substances?
Sure, of course. So Youth Rise is an international organization. We consist of young people who use drugs and young people who are involved in advocating for drug policy reform and harm reduction all around the world. We mobilize young people to be engaged in advocating for full spectrum harm reduction and drug policy reform to promote our health and human rights. Our work aims to amplify, maximize, and center the priorities of young people who use drugs and young people affected by drug policies and full spectrum harm reduction at both the national, regional, and the international levels. And we do this through coalition building, trainings, advocacy, evidence gathering, and networking. So I guess to explain a little bit about full spectrum harm reduction, it's a bit of a buzzword at the moment, but basically we've been using it in the sense that harm reduction has primarily in the past and kind of still been focused on the global north and also primarily on injecting drug use. Very important topic still, but young people who use drugs and all people who use drugs use them for a variety of reasons in a variety of settings and in a variety of different ways. So full spectrum harm reduction incorporates all of the people who use drugs, all the ways in which they use them, and takes into account the political, social, and environmental context in which they use them as well. So it looks past harm reduction primarily focused around injecting drug use and goes to look at other forms of harm reduction as well as incorporating injecting drug use, and really focuses on the ways in which young people are using drugs and the context in the global south with the far greater diversity of issues, which can even be as severe as we know as extrajudicial killings in many countries as well. So we operate with, through and because of our international working group, which is a group of young people who use drugs or young people advocating for reform around the world, who represent young people who use drugs in their country and bring the issues of young people who use drugs to Youth Rise. So we are informed by all of the input from our international working group, but we also provide them with capacity building. We support them with the advocacy efforts in their countries, we provide resources to them, small grants and things like this, so that they can make change in their own communities, whether that's going to harm reduction services that exist and trying to get them to be more youth friendly, which I'll talk about in a bit, or going to their governments and explaining why the war on drugs and the criminal approach to drug use is not serving them and is causing more harms. So yeah, we do a lot of work around creating data. There's a severe lack of data on young people who use drugs, the types of drugs we use, how we use them. And we do our best to create evidence and support evidence gathering for our population, by our population. So yeah, that's a little bit about Youth Rise. We do a lot of work at kind of high level UN bodies, like the Commission on Narcotic Drugs is a huge point of advocacy for us. We also do a lot of work with UNAIDS, UNICEF, and a little bit of work now recently with the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights as well. So always prioritizing young people who use drugs issues in these spaces and bringing the issues faced by our international working group members in their countries to these levels. So yeah, that's a bit about Youth Rise.
That was really interesting. Thank you for sharing about that. So just to clarify a bit more, because, there's this narrative often that young people don't know what they're talking about. We should always listen to adults over that. So why do you feel that it is important to pay attention to the experiences of youth who use drugs?
I mean, there's a lot of reasons. So I'll start with young people who use drugs are a young key population that gets left behind. So we're talked about at all levels of policy making and in service provision sometimes, but we're rarely ever consulted about our needs. So the war on drugs is often waged in our name. People say protect the young people, keep the young people away from drugs. We've got to keep drugs criminalized to keep young people safe. So they're talking about us without actually asking what that looks like, not asking what we want and what we know is best for us. And we cannot continue to be left behind, as the Sustainable Development Goals term is, especially as we look towards drug policy reform in some countries. So there is some changes around drug policy reform. There is some shifts towards decriminalization, and even, talking about this at UN level now. There is some, UN bodies signed the UN Common Position, which promotes decriminalization. So not only in government level, but also at higher international bodies like that. They are talking about these movements, but we need to make sure that they don't leave behind young people who use drugs. Because it can be a tough point of conversation. Like, we face multiple stigma and discriminations when we try to access services, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be part of the conversation or that the conversation shouldn't happen. It is tricky. We do understand that when it comes to young people using drugs, there's a lot of fear around that. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have the conversations, because young people are using drugs. So we need to be talking about how we can keep them safe, and it's not through criminalization. We're often more vulnerable in society due to a lack of financial resources, autonomy, and often experimenting and exploring our minds from a young age, or dealing with trauma and mental health issues as well. And we are the future, as they always say, so you need to include us in shaping it. So yeah, that's, I guess, a summary of why it's important that we pay attention to our needs, but also, there's the basic of we're humans too, we matter. And just because you use drugs doesn't mean you're checked out of society and that you no longer have your needs met. So it's really important that we're part of the conversation.
Yeah, I love that. I love the phrase that you used where you said, we are the future, so we should have a part in shaping it. So along those lines, what do you feel are uniquely youth needs or experiences that communities and policymakers need to understand?
Yeah, so we have a lot of needs, a lot of the same needs as older people who use drugs, but then also that nuanced needs of that younger generation as well. We require harm reduction services that are tailored to our needs. So we're often dependent on family, education systems, and therefore have less liberty and control of our lives. We're subject to a lot of fear mongering about drug use from a young age, from a child in school. And we have a severe lack of accurate information about drugs, their possible risks, and like how to mitigate them as well. Just telling us not to do them obviously hasn't worked. And so we need to address the actual possible harms that can come with drug use, as well as talking about the pleasure as well that can come from that, which is another difficult conversation for people to have when it comes to young people. People are so focused on stopping us from ever trying drugs in the first place, or stopping us once we've started, but they don't even try to help us mitigate the risks once we begin using them. So we have a severe lack, and we need access to harm reduction services. So obtaining information, paraphernalia for safer injection and smoking, drug dependence and opioid substitution treatment for those who want to stop using drugs, HIV testing, counseling, the whole package for harm reduction. But we need to go beyond that as well and look at access to drug checking in both nightlife settings, but also in street-based settings. And evidence-based treatment that is not forced. So a lot of, that same thing you said earlier on, that young people aren't trusted to know what's best for them. But forcing us into treatment centers without our own consent is not the answer. And it doesn't result in reducing our harm, especially when it comes to later on in life as well. And a lot of us will go back to using and maybe be using it in more harmful ways because they don't want to get caught and forced into these systems again. And there's a lot of human rights violations that happen within treatment centers as well, especially towards young people who use drugs. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a severe lack of data about our drug use trends, our needs, our challenges, and our reasons for using. And where data is collected in harm reduction and health services that exist, we're underrepresented in these surveys as well. because we're less likely to access those harm reduction services if they're not tailored for us and to us. We need peer-to-peer harm reduction services, support, access to information. And when existing harm reduction services are already struggling to survive because they're operating a lot of the times in a difficult legal environment because of criminalization and a lack of funding, they struggle to meet the own population that they already have of people who use drugs. And young people who use drugs are included in people who use drugs, but we need to have separate and tailored services like women who use drugs do as well. And because we're a tricky target population, we understand we're tricky, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't be addressed and we shouldn't be asked what our needs are. And we need to be supported in these harm reduction services and integrated into them. We need free services because maybe we don't have the access to the funds. We need earlier opening times and later opening times so that it's outside of maybe our school settings and schedules. And also a huge barrier to access to services for us is age of consent laws and parental consent requirements. So these exist primarily for the age group of 18 and under, that they can't access these services without parental consent. But they also do exist older than that. And regardless, you should be able to access health services anonymously, whether you're 18 above or younger. We're also routinely subjected to the traumas of arbitrary detention, extortion, police violence, torture, and ill treatment in the name of drug control. And these measures violate international juvenile justice standards. These ones are outlined in the Beijing and Havana rules as well, which stipulate that the primary goal of juvenile justice should be to divert youth from the criminal justice system. But this is not the case when it comes to drugs, apparently, which is the case for a lot of laws. They seem to go out the window when it comes to human rights for people who use drugs. And the consequences of a criminal record for young people are really life-altering. Same as for everyone, but for this to happen at such a young age, we suffer from such a huge amount of discrimination, stigmatization from our communities, isolation from our families, diminished access to education, getting kicked out of education because of drug use, employment, housing, financial instability. All of these are major issues for us and needs that need to be addressed. And there's also a huge disconnect in the age that young people can be convicted or receive a criminal record and the age at which they can access harm reduction, which I always find interesting. You know, we can't access harm reduction, but we can be arrested for drug use, which, you know, obviously doesn't match up. And yeah, I think that's a bit of an explanation of kind of our needs and the reasons we have these needs in the first place.
Yeah, that was very insightful. So I guess just to go a bit further into this question, do you have any practical experiences or case studies of harm reduction in criminalized or decriminalized or legalized settings and the impact that it's had?
Yeah, so I mean, like I explained, services for young people who use drugs rarely exist. And when they do, they're having to kind of exist on the margins of legality. So it's hard to talk about particular case studies. I can point everyone towards a report we came out with a few years ago on specifically the population of young people who inject drugs, but it does look deeper into other forms of drug use as well, where we went through case studies of specific harm reduction services that exist in communities in, let me list them for you. We've got Burundi, Kenya, Nigeria, Nepal, Philippines, Vietnam, Russia, Ukraine, USA, and Colombia. So there's a wide range of different case studies you can have a look at. And they've had to operate in, interesting ways. It depends on the context. Some of them, all of them have noted that the biggest barrier to making their services youth-friendly and youth-led is the criminalization of drug use. But they've had to operate in different ways. So you've got some who are able to include young people who use drugs as peers in their services, to do outreach, to bring in young people who use drugs into their harm reduction services. Some are only able to do maybe HIV testing because that's the only thing that's allowed within the law. And then they can try to the best of their abilities, integrate other services at the same time. Whereas others in heavily criminalized settings may not be able to do any sort of service provision like health testing or drug paraphernalia and all of this kind of thing. They may not be able to do any of that. And in those settings, what they try to do is to train up young people who use drugs to be able to understand their health and human rights so that they can advocate for themselves and to kind of build networks amongst themselves as well, and bringing people together just to have a safer space for people to find that community and build advocacy cases together. So it kind of varies depending on the criminal setting that you're in and what countries allow. And a lot of these services are existing, kind of outside of the law a little bit. But yeah, it's hard to pull on one particular case study, but they are having to operate in different contexts and therefore adjust what their services are and maybe what stage they're at in delivering services depending on their context. Yeah.
So as you mentioned, a lot of these support measures, especially these harm reduction practices, it's become harder because, the government criminalizes a lot of things, including, there's the whole age of consent stuff. So what other things do you think do governments or systems or community support hinder?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so like I kind of noted this a bit earlier on, but where governments do support harm reduction services, and they'll talk about it extensively if they do support it, and they provide funding for harm reduction services, but there's not the same energy there or funding there for youth-focused and tailored services. So when governments are supporting harm reduction services, they need to also be supporting a part of this harm reduction service to be youth-led and youth-focused, or for separate services to be set up and led by young people. We need the removal of age of consent laws, like you said. That's a huge hindrance to us accessing services. And we also need to be ensuring that services that are being provided, government also needs to, and I mean, a lot of these services are running not by the government, by civil society organizations, and they're doing an incredible job, and governments can support by putting funding behind the efforts more than anything, I think. And diverting, a huge issue is that governments are funding heavily the criminal response. So there's a huge amount of money in policing, huge amount of money in justice systems that are perpetuating the harm of the war on drugs. But the percentage of the amount of funding that goes towards actual harm reduction services for us is insanely minuscule. So they need to divert their funding away from punitive measures and towards supporting us. They also need to make sure that that our services, not just governments, but community organizations that are implementing these services, they also need to make sure that they're comprehensive. So, instead of having one health service will provide needle and syringe programs, and this isn't the case where we're actually able to access them as young people. So one service might be doing this, another service is doing HIV testing and it's on the other side of town. Another service might be doing access to methadone assisted therapy, and that's in another service. So having everything in one place as well is hugely beneficial for young people who might not have that mobility, and all people who use drugs, but also particularly young people who use drugs who might not have the access to funds to be able to move between the different services. And also to support young people, they need to be providing nutritional support, economic empowerment projects as well, ensuring that we have funds to support ourselves. And also a huge thing that we need to be educated on is know your rights campaigns and trainings, so that we're actually able to be informed about what we can and what police can and can't do to you. I mean, it's another topic, but the knowing your rights in the first place can help you to access services and use the law to your benefit. And we're not taught about that for a reason. So they need to also be ensuring that we do know our rights, and this needs to be integrated into any harm reduction service that exists. Because we're also fed a lot of information based on rumors and what people's experience has been, but the actual training on what our rights are is severely lacking across the board. And more than anything, we need governments to decriminalize drugs. We need to make sure that when the governments are decriminalizing drugs and making these movements, that they're not leaving us behind just because we're a difficult topic of conversation. We're a bit more tricky maybe to talk about when it comes to young people and children using drugs. but we can't decriminalize in the name of keeping people safe and a more just society, and then not then keep criminalized for young people who use drugs, or keep criminalizing us when we're using drugs under a certain age. That's not going to work, and that's just going to leave us behind, and it's just continuing to perpetuate the issue. We have to have the tough conversations. We also need school-based drug education that is informative, not just fear-mongering. We only harm with fear. And it perpetuates stigma and pushes us away from accessing support where it does exist. And we also need, hugely, we need data collection by us and about us. It supports everything that we do. We can't make our case. We can make our case, but it's a harder case to make when we don't have the data to back it up. So we need data collection about us. When it comes to submitting data to, let's say, the UNODC for their World Drug Report, they need to be submitting data on young people who use drugs that isn't just how many they managed to get to stop using drugs in a year based on how many were put in treatment centers. We need actual data about the drugs that we're using, why we're using them, the trends in use, and the ways in which we're using them as well, so that we can actually advocate better for ourselves when on the ground and in our own national countries. Yeah. I hope that's a bit of an answer about how they are hindering our work and what they can do better.
Yes, that was a wonderful answer, very clear. And as you mentioned, we should be focusing on the youth. So in that vein, as youth are creating and forming their identities, how are they navigating substance use, and what should they have access to? Because as we know, substance use, it's a spectrum. It can range from pleasure to pain to dependence to relief, so many things. So what do you think of that?
Well, I mean, yeah, drug use is complex, and reasons behind drug use is complex as well. It's, we're taught that people use drugs purely because they have mental health issues, and the only path in drug use is towards having a problem with your drug use or problematic drug use. But I mean, we know that's not true. Young people use drugs for a variety of reasons, but also for the same reasons that older people use drugs. We just do it in a far more stigmatized environment, and are also far more vulnerable as we rely on, like I said, family education systems as well. We do use for a variety of reasons. I mean, young people in themselves, we are nuanced, and we can be going through a lot, especially if you're, a teenager, you're dealing with hormones, maybe you're trying to find your way in the world, and you also could be using to explore your mind, explore yourself as you do at that age. And there's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong with that is the system we're doing that in. So we're looking for a sense of belonging or autonomy over our bodies, and also within communities. Maybe we find a sense of belonging amongst people who use drugs. And the same way we kind of explore with alcohol as a teenager, we could use drugs for pain relief. We also use drugs when, as a result of living with trauma, which is a very valid reason also to use drugs. Criminalizing us and arresting us does nothing to support us. It hasn't stopped us from using. And to protect, we need to be educated about the possible risks of the drugs that we're taking, so that we can mitigate them. And because of our lack of autonomy and income, we opt often for the cheapest and most accessible substances, which are often not what people are saying they are, or they're new psychoactive substances and there's not enough research done on them. So therefore, we're not aware of what is in our drug. I mean, no one is aware of what is in our drugs in an illegal system that we operate in without drug checking. But we need drug checking for young people who use drugs. And like I said earlier, we need it on the streets as much as we need it in nightlife settings as well. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to read out, not really a question from the audience, but more of a statement. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on those. So we have, instead of focusing solely on promoting abstinence, harm reduction strategies aim to provide practical interventions and resources that help individuals reduce the negative consequences of their actions. This may involve providing access to clean needles and syringes to reduce the transmission of bloodborne infections among people who inject drugs, offering drug testing services to identify the presence of harmful substances, or providing education and resources for safer sex practices. A drug-free society is not achievable, If you cannot stop drug use in prisons, you will never stop it in normal society. We should prioritize crime reduction over the health of people who use drugs. They are human beings and have rights to healthcare, whereas drug law infringe on the human rights of people who use drugs and can destroy their lives by restricting their access to healthcare, education, and employment. Evidence suggests that harm reduction strategies reduce crime. So I feel this is mostly what you've said, but if there's anything you'd like to add on to these comments.
No, just I guess an emphasis on the fact that a drug-free society is not achievable and has never existed in the first place. Yeah, I think a few of us, many of us maybe in the field know that, drugs have been around since the dawn of time, and animals and humans have experimented with their mind for a long time, or have been dealing with traumas and issues in their minds through drugs for a long time as well. And the majority of people use drugs with no problematic drug use, and with and they're doing okay. So to continue to wage a war based on health and supporting people, it's not serving its need. So yeah, I agree with all of the points that Sandeep has said here. And hi, Sandeep.
It's very great. And I think there's also a colonial aspect to it, right? Because if you look at a lot of societies prior to colonization, like I'm originally from India, and we have a festival there where one of the gods, the holy drink, is literally cannabis mixed with milk, right? And these kind of things it wasn't just accepted, it was something that was a good thing to do, essentially, right? So you look at where all this moralization of drugs comes from this colonial mindset. So
yeah, 100%. Yeah, colonization has been completely perpetuated by the war on drugs. And it's disgusting how the global north has pushed the war on drugs on the global south, and how America has pushed it on the whole world. It's horrible, and to keep that narrative, it's so insulting to keep the narrative that you're doing it to protect people while you're punishing Indigenous people for practices that have always been part of their society. Yeah, it really is. It's insulting and disgusting that it continues.
So I'm just a bit mindful of time.
Yeah, sorry.
No worries. Your answers were very, very thought-provoking. So I'd just like to get to our final question. So how would you encourage youth who use drugs to get their views on drug policy heard, particularly in contexts where there might be stigma and/or punishment?
Yeah, so this is a tricky question. So in contexts where there may be stigma and punishment, I mean, that's also a scale. So there's some places where you might be stigmatized, and that is harmful. But then there's other cases where you could be punished for engaging in drug policy reform and harm reduction in certain settings, and we need to be mindful and careful of that. I mean, so there's a few different ways you could try to advocate for your rights. So I mean, getting involved with organizations like YouthRise and other international organizations that work on these topics. Like I said, the way that we work and other organizations in the field also work, is by getting the information about what's happening on the ground and elevating those voices to a higher level. So then it doesn't have to, and in the case where the person can't be the one speaking out, they can be part of providing that evidence, and we speak out on their behalf at these levels. So that's one way to go about it. It could also be with connecting with international organizations that exist in your country, or national NGOs, regional NGOs that exist in your country that are working on other topics that aren't primarily on drug use. So it could be on human rights, or really any of the sustainable development goals, and then try to make room. So working with them and then trying to make room for conversations about the impact that the war on drugs has on their organization's work, their topic, because as we know, the war on drugs, as the war on drugs continues, the sustainable development goals are not achievable. There's actually a really interesting report that was done by, I think it's Health Rights Action or Health Poverty Action, and it's about if you look it up, it's the sustainable development goals and the war on drugs, and it explains how the war on drugs hinders the achievability of all of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And so if you have a look at that and try to inform yourself about how it's impacting all of these various issues like climate related issues, human rights related issues, which is quite obvious, gender issues, then you can be able to get into these spaces and maybe try to carve out conversation on the issues of young people who use drugs that you're facing. So maybe that's one way to do it, where drug policy organizations don't exist. Also to find the community, so to connect with these other organizations that are working on these topics where they do exist, making the case for young people who use drugs. And if in-person contact is not possible, then we can find communities online and start to get some mobilization there. It's also important to search for resources and information on your legal rights and access to justice as well, so that you can start to advocate especially within your national context, so you understand where you can operate, how you can advocate, and where it's more risky. And yeah, I think that's my ideas around how you can get involved in more stigmatizing and punishment environments. Yeah.
I think that's really helpful, especially coming from a country like Singapore, where everything is where the entire country is so heavily surveilled to the point where people self-police, especially when it comes to drug issues, right? Because there's so much fear because our drug laws are so harsh. Yeah. So I guess another way would be for us to, start these conversations amongst our peers, families, stuff like that, sort of shift the conscious. So along those lines, we have a question from the audience saying, how can we start the conversation in our social circles about harm reduction, aside from getting peers to support the movement?
Well, interestingly, we actually had Youthrise ran an event last week in the run up to Support Don't Punish, like this webinar is about, where we taught people how to support Don't Punish over the dinner table. So how to bring conversations around why drug policy reform is important and the need for harm reduction services for young people specifically, but how to have these conversations with your families, with your peers, with people who on the spectrum of agreeing with the war on drugs and maybe being a bit more on the reform side. I'm not the expert on that one because the two women who gave these workshops were incredible. So I don't want to take away from everything that they taught, but what I can say is that those resources will be uploaded, the recordings of the workshops, both in Spanish and English, and then the actual content itself will be uploaded on our website soon and promoted across our social media. If you follow We Are Youthrise on Instagram and the other Youthrise channels, we'll promote that, and you can have the access to that workshop we did specifically on that issue of how do we talk to people about this as a young person without getting stigmatized in the process. So yeah, we tackled that last week, I think.
That's really cool, and I love the name of that workshop. So yeah. And there's also this narrative frequently that harm reduction is simply promoting drug use, right? You're giving them needles, and it's a very common thing that people frequently run into. And one of the audience members has asked, how do you address the public's worries that the government is promoting drug use from harm reduction policies?
Yeah, so that's a difficult topic. I mean, first of all, making the case of the fact that drug use already exists in the criminalized settings and has only increased under criminalization. And the lack of and not having harm reduction services is against the human rights of all people. So I guess, yeah, having a look at the statistics in your country for those who use drugs, but also those living, those people using drugs who live with HIV, or the drug overdose death rates, if there's statistics around that in your country as well. I think that's a good point, is to kind of start with data, which is why also we need data on young people who use drugs. But to start with data and then look at how it's increasing with time or increasing with criminalization, and then also bringing data of the countries that have implemented harm reduction successfully and the different types of harm reduction that they have, or the varying scale at which they have it. And then just start to have conversations around why it's important to take care of people. If you're supposed to take care of people in general, and that's your job as a government, is to provide a safe society to live in, Why are people who use drugs excluded? We also deserve health services. You could take the angle, you know, some governments don't really want to have that approach of like, oh, because you should care for people, that's obvious to them when they're not doing it. But you could also try to explain through crime prevention. So let's say in harm reduction settings or harm reduction services are providing services for people who use drugs, then there's less likelihood of spread of HIV within the communities, amongst people who don't use drugs, reduce crime as well, and ensuring that there's let's say a needle and syringe programs where you exchange used needles for clean needles and then they get disposed of safely. That's if you want to talk about it from like save the children and people who don't use drugs angle, you can talk about how there'll be less needles on the street, and just try to look at how to frame the argument in a way that the particular person in government you're talking to is going to understand. And if they don't understand that they should just care for people and human rights of people anyway, then try to talk about other people, not just people who use drugs, to start the conversation anyway. And then, progress to getting them to a point to understanding why it's a human rights basic to have access to services in the first place. Yeah, I hope that helps answer a little bit about it. But again, the workshop, we touched on this in the workshop last week.
It was actually really helpful, and I'm definitely going to check out that workshop because TJC does do door knocking because we want to call for a moratorium on the death penalty in Singapore, especially because it's primarily used for drug-related crimes. And we very often run into people where we try to explain harm reduction, and it's just like, oh, but you're just giving them more drugs, And it's it was very helpful to have sort of a more strategized way for us to approach these comments.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, definitely check out the workshop, but yeah, also I guess if there's a few organizations, there's a few international ones and also in certain countries where it's parents of people who have young people who've died of overdose, and there is many of those people who have suffered from this loss of a child due to drug overdose that now advocate for harm reduction services. They might still think that they don't want people to use drugs. That might still be their belief, but and that they wish their child who's no longer with them had never used drugs. But they also, more than anything, wish that there had been a harm reduction service available to them so that they never had to have an overdose in the first place. That's more important, having the access to a service like that than making sure that someone doesn't use it in the first place, because obviously people are using it. So why should they die for using drugs? It's absolutely crazy. So yeah, kind of looking at the different groups that you can hone in on people and tap into people's emotional side, and what it is that they're passionate about and why it is that they're so against these harm reduction services outside of just people who are using drugs. Where does that fear come from for them? And then try to break that down and kind of be strategic with the way that you explain why you do what you do. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing all of that. So this was an amazing session. It brought up a lot of new points that I hadn't even thought of before, a lot of new strategies that I'm excited to implement. So are there any final comments you'd like to say? And if anyone in the audience has any questions, please put them in now.
I don't personally have any final comments. It's been really, really great to be here. I really appreciate this space and the opportunity to share about young people who use drugs needs, challenges we face, and what the governments and communities can be doing better to support us. I just would love to see people try to integrate this debate into other spaces outside of the bubble of drug policy reform and harm reduction groups. Bring this into, TJC working on the abolishment of the death penalty and how that intersects, and looking at the intersections between the war on drugs and all the other issues that we face in life, and how the war on drugs is making it worse. So yeah, I would really love if everyone could have a look at what you're passionate about and then see how the war on drugs is making it even worse and what you can do to dismantle it. Yeah.
I think that's very well said, especially because, especially in Singapore, the areas that we go door knocking are low SES, low socioeconomic status neighborhoods, because those are the ones that are most impacted by these drug policies. And they tend to be the ones that don't think about it the most, because they're more concerned about their immediate day-to-day needs, right? And we have so many organizations, whether government or other civil society organizations, that work with these low SES communities, families, without really realizing that there are so many other things that, intersect with this. A lot of them won't realize that, hey, you got to look at the drug policy aspect of this, when you're helping people out. So that's
Definitely.
very well said. And thank you so much for joining us today and for taking time to share all these wonderful things with us. I'm sure everyone has a lot to think about, and I encourage everyone to go check out YouthRise's Instagram. Do you want to?
It's We Are YouthRise on Instagram. Yeah.
All right. And of course, if you're interested in joining TJC, you can always drop us an email at transformjustice.sg@gmail.com. And YouthRise, is there any way they can contact you?
Yeah, you can contact me through ruby@youthrise.org, or you can check out our website. We have all the emails for everyone who works with us, and then also all our social media channels linked there as well. So you can go check us out on our website, youthrise.org.
Right, that's amazing. Thank you everyone for joining. TJC has a festival coming up, so do check that out at the link in our bio on our Instagram. And thank you for joining, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.